Roald Dahl, Esio, Trot. Mr. Hoppy lived in a small flat high up in a tall concrete building. He lived alone. He had always been a lonely man, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr. Hoppy's life. One was the flowers he grew on his balcony. They grew in pots and tubs and baskets, and in summer the little balcony became a riot of color. Mr. Hoppy's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself. The balcony immediately below Mr. Hoppy's juts out a good bit further from the building than his own, so Mr. Hoppy always had a fine view of what was going on down there. This balcony belonged to an intelligent middle-aged lady called Mrs. Silver. Mrs. Silver was a widow who also lived alone, and although she didn't know it, it was she who was the object of Mr. Hoppy's secret love. He had loved her from his balcony for many years, but he was a very shy man, and he had never been able to bring himself to give her even the smallest hint of his love. Every morning, Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver exchanged polite conversation, the one looking down from above, the other looking up, but that was as far as it ever went. The distance between their balconies might not have been more than a few yards, but to Mr. Hoppy it seemed like a million miles. He looked in to invite Mrs. Silver off for a cup of tea and a biscuit, but every time he was about to form the words on his lips, his courage failed him. As I said, he was a very, very shy man. Oh, if only, he kept telling himself, if only he could do something tremendous, like saving her life or rescue her from a gang of armed dogs. If only he could perform some great feat that would make him a hero in her eyes. If only. The trouble with Mrs. Silver was that she gave all of love to somebody else, and that somebody was a small tortoise called Elfie. Every day, when Mr. Hoppy looked over his balcony and saw Mrs. Silver whispering endearments to Elfie and stroking his shell, he felt a million jealous. He wouldn't even have minded becoming a tortoise himself. It meant Mrs. Silver stirring his shell each morning and whispering endearment to him. Alfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years, and he lived on a balcony summer and winter. Planks had been placed around the sides of a balcony so that Alfie could walk about without toppling over the edge. And in one corner there was a little house into which Alfie would crawl every night to keep warm. When the colder weather came along in November, Mrs. Silver would fill Alfie's house with dry hay, and the tortoise would crawl in here and bury himself deep under the hay and go to sleep for months on end without food or water. This is called hibernating. In early spring, when Alfie felt the warmer weather through his shell, he would wake up and crawl very slowly out of his house onto the balcony. And Mrs. Silver would clap her hands with joy and cry out, Welcome back, my darling one. Oh, how I have missed you. It was at times like these that Mr. Hoppy wished more than ever that he could change places with Elfie and become the tortoise. Now we'd come to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electric Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony beer watching Mrs. Silver serving Elfie his breakfast. Here's the love of the lettuce for you, my lovely, she was saying. And here's a slice of fresh tomato and a piece of crispy celery. Good morning, Mrs. Silver, Mr. Hoppy said. Elfie's looking well this morning. Isn't he gorgeous? Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming at him. Absolutely gorgeous, Mr. Hoppy said, not meaning it. And now, as he looked down at Mrs. Silver's smiling face gazing up into his own, he thought for a thousandth time how pretty she was, how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart attached with love. I do so wish he could grow a little faster, Mrs. Silver was saying. Every spring, when he wakes up from his winter sleep, I weigh him on the kitchen scales, and do you know that in all the 11 years I'd have him, he's not grading more than 3 ounces. That's almost nothing. What does he weigh now? Mr. Hoppy asked her. Just 13 ounces, Mrs. Silver answered. About as much as grapefruit. Yes, well, tortoises are very slow growers, Mr. Hoppy solemnly. But they can live for 100 of years. I know that, Mrs. Silver said, but I do so wish he could grow just a little bit bigger. He's just such a tiny wee fellow. He seems just fine as he is, Mr. Hoppy said. No, he's not just fine, Mrs. Silver cried. Try to think how misguided it must make him feel to be so teachy. Everyone wants to grow up. You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you? Mr. Hoppy said, and even as he said it his mind suddenly went click and an amazing idea came rushing into his head. Of course I would, Mrs. Silver cried. I'd give anything to make it happen. Why, I've been seeing pictures of giant toys that are so huge people can ride on their backs. If Alfie were to see those, he'd turn green with envy. Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here's, surely, was his big change. Grab it, he told himself. Grab it quick! Mrs. Silver, he said, I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises grow faster, if that's really what you want. You do? She cried. Oh, please tell me I'm feeding him the wrong things. I worked in North America once, Mr. Hoppy said. That's where all these tortoises in England come from, and the brilliant Charlesman told me the secret. Tell me, cried Mrs. Silver. I beg you to tell me, Mr. Hoppy. I will your self for life. When he heard the words your slave for life, a little shiver of excitement swept through Mr. Hoppy. Wait there, he said. I'll have to go in and write something down for you." In a couple of minutes, Mr. Hoppy was back on and balcony with a sheet of paper in his hand. "I am going to lower it to you on a bit of string," he said, "or it might blow away. Here it comes." Mrs. Silver cut the paper and held it up in front of her. This is what she read. "Esio Trot, Esio Trot, tag Redupt, Imogno, Esio Trot, Wogpoo, Fuftpoo, Tustpoo, Georgepoo, Whoopoo, Loosepoo, Igrod, Izug, Foot, Plug, Tom no fat, Esio Trot, Top no fat, Techno, Ilbog Dov." What does it mean?" she asked. "Is it another language?" "It's tortoise language," Mr. Hoppy said. "Tortoises are very backward creatures. Therefore, they can only understand words that are written backwards. That's obvious, isn't it?" "I suppose so," Mrs. Silver said, bewildered. "Esio Trot is simply tortoise spelled backwards," says Mrs. Silver. "Look at it." "So it is," Mrs. Silver said. "The other words are spelled backwards too," Mr. Hoppy said. "If you turn them round into human language, they simply say, 'Tortoise, tortoise, get bigger, bigger. Come on, tortoise, grow up, puff up, shoot up. Spring come, blow up, swell up. George, guzzled, stop, gup. Put on fat, tortoise, put on fat. Get on, go to food." Mrs. Silver explained the magic words on the paper closely. "I guess you're right," she said. "How clever. But there's an awful lot of puss in it. Are they something special?" "Pooh is a very strong word in any language," Mr. Hoppy says. "Exactly with tortoise. Now what you have to do, Mrs. Silver, is hold Elfie up to your face and whisper these words to him every 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. Let me hear you practice them." Very slowly and strongly a little off were the strange words. Mrs. Silver read the whole message out loud in tortoise things. "Not bad," Mr. Hoppy said. "But try to get a little more expressions into it when you say it to Elfie. If you do it properly, I'll bet you anything you like them. In a few months' time he'll be twice as big as he is now." "I'll try it," Mrs. Silver said. "I'll try anything, of course I will. But I can't believe it work." "You wait and see," Mr. Hoppy said, smiling at her. Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was simply quivering all over with excitement. "Your slave your life," he kept repeating to himself. "What a blish!" But there was a lot of work to be done before that happened. The only furniture in Mr. Hoppy's small living room was a table and 2 chairs. These he moved into his bedroom. Then he went out and bought a sheet of thick canvas and spread it over the entry living room floor to protect his carpet. Next, he got out a telephone book and wrote down the address of every pet shop in the city. There were 14 of them altogether. Thank you for listening. Bye.